When a routine property dispute turned into a tense legal showdown, a skeptical judge discovered that underestimating Clint Eastwood was the biggest mistake of his career. In the quiet coastal enclave of Monterey County, the courthouse usually saw minor squabbles and small claims. This time, however, Hollywood royalty had arrived. Reporters, locals, and curious onlookers squeezed into every seat, and the hallway buzzed with questions. Why was Clint Eastwood, at 94 years old, walking into court unrepresented? How would he fare against one of the region's most ruthless real estate developers, and a judge who seemed more amused than impartial? He walked in wearing a crisp, understated suit, far from the cowboy persona he'd made famous. His eyes were calm, his posture steady, and although murmurs rippled through the crowd, he paid them no heed. Instead, he focused on the towering bench where Judge Marjorie Bascom presided. From the moment she glanced down at him over her half-rimmed glasses, her bemused smirk suggested she expected a show, not a serious legal battle. Clint's opponent in this drama was Derek Hammond, a man known for slick deals and brazen tactics. Hammond's real estate empire included gleaming condos and upscale resorts, many built on contested land. But this time, his target was the wrong piece of property. He'd pushed construction beyond authorized boundaries, creeping into Clint's land while assuming no one would challenge him. After all, how serious could an aging actor be in a legal war? When proceedings opened, Hammond's high-priced lawyer, Charles Denton, rose and flashed a broad smile. He introduced himself with practiced flair, addressing the court as though delivering lines in a meticulously choreographed play. Then came the moment everyone anticipated. Would Clint speak for himself? He stood, resting both hands lightly on the table in front of him. The press leaned in, cameras discreetly rolling on phones or hidden recorders. Reporters expected a cinematic one-liner, a wry grin, maybe even a reference to some iconic role. But Clint's voice, low and unhurried, carried no pretense of performance. "I'm here because a man built over my boundary line," he said. "I tried every civil route. Letters, phone calls, multiple warnings. They were ignored. Now I'm left with no choice but to seek the court's help." He sat calm as a deep lake. There was no bravado, no theatrical flourish. Judge Bascom raised an eyebrow, glancing at the piles of legal files in front of her. "Mr. Eastwood," she said dryly, "I see you have no formal counsel. Are you certain you want to proceed this way?" Clint simply nodded. "I'm certain, Your Honor." The judge pursed her lips. "Very well, let's get started." A ripple of laughter crossed a few faces in the gallery. Denton couldn't resist a condescending grin as he stepped forward and presented the defense's view. "Your Honor, this is a simple misunderstanding. My client holds all proper permits. Any slight overlap is an error in surveying." Clint watched, expression unreadable. Outside, bright sunshine bathed the courthouse steps where more journalists waited, their cameras pointed at the building as though anticipating fireworks. Inside, the drama unfolded more methodically, each side laying out its opening statements. The tension, however, came from the judge's barely concealed skepticism. She spoke to Clint with a tone that hinted she viewed this as little more than an amusing vanity exercise on his part. When Denton finished, Clint rose again. He moved toward the judge's bench with a set of aerial photographs under one arm. "These images, Your Honor, show where the official boundary lies and where Hammond's team built. You can see the overlap clearly." Judge Bascom's eyes flicked across the photos, and a momentary grimace betrayed that something in them caught her attention. Still, her tone remained clipped. "Yes, well, we'll see how it all stands up under scrutiny." Denton flashed a patronizing smile. "Mr. Eastwood, no offense, but are you sure you have the expertise to interpret these documents? Survey law is complex, and so are municipal regulations." Clint set the photos down. "I'm sure," he said simply. The judge called a recess. As the bailiff announced it, the crowd rustled. Curious bystanders whispered to one another, waiting for Clint to stumble. But when he left the courtroom, he walked with the same sure strides he'd always had, a living testament to an era in Hollywood when men didn't flinch under pressure. During the break, reporters cornered Hammond and Denton in the hallway. "Sir, do you think you'll settle?" one of them asked. Hammond scoffed. "Settle? Over what? This is a publicity stunt. I have no doubt we'll prevail." Denton nodded. "Of course, we respect Mr. Eastwood, but property disputes require more than stardom to win." In another corner, Clint quietly fielded questions from a smaller group of journalists. "Mr. Eastwood, do you really think you can out-argue a trained attorney?" He answered with a measured calm. "This isn't about out-arguing. It's about showing proof. If I'm right, I'm right. If I'm wrong, I'll own it." When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The gallery sensed a brewing confrontation, and the judge's impatience hinted she wanted to see Clint fail quickly or produce a miracle. She tapped her gavel. "Proceed," she ordered. Clint called his first witness, an aging surveyor named Lionel Barnes. Barnes shuffled to the stand, gripping a walking cane. Once sworn in, he recounted the original boundary lines from decades ago, referencing official records. Denton tried to rattle him, questioning the accuracy of older surveys and the possibility of accidental boundary drift. Barnes squinted. "Boundary drift might happen over a long time," he admitted, "but not to this extent. This is intentional overreach." Denton waved the statement aside, delivering a smarmy grin to the jury. "Intentional, you say? Could it not be a mere half-acre discrepancy, one that was unaccounted for in older documents?" Barnes bristled. "If it was half an acre, that'd be one thing. It's closer to 3 acres. That doesn't just disappear." The judge watched intently, occasionally glancing at Clint, who listened without interruption. When Barnes finished, Clint thanked him, letting the man step down. Denton huffed, walking away as though the testimony meant little. Next, Clint presented official notices he'd sent to Hammond. Each letter demanded a stop to construction. They'd been certified, signed upon delivery, yet no changes were made. Denton claimed the letters were ambiguous, that they arrived too late, and that Hammond's team had already invested significant funds into the development. "You want us to tear everything down?" Hammond burst out, unable to restrain himself. "That's absurd." Clint's gaze flicked toward him. "What's absurd is ignoring repeated warnings. You built on land that wasn't yours." Hammond barked a laugh. "People build all the time. Mistakes happen. That's business." The judge rapped her gavel. "Gentlemen, control yourselves." But her disapproval seemed directed more at Clint for daring to speak so plainly. The shift didn't go unnoticed by spectators who sensed a bias in the air. Denton seized the moment. "Your Honor, if we may call our own expert witness?" She nodded. "Yes, go ahead." A polished consultant named Marcia Warren took the stand. She brandished thick binders and spouted jargon that bordered on the impenetrable. She claimed the original property markers were imprecise, and that modern GPS scans painted a different picture of the boundary. Clint stood waiting for his chance to cross-examine. When it came, he walked to the front with slow, measured steps. "Miss Warren," he said, "did you personally inspect the site or just review digital data?" She blinked. "I reviewed the data collected by Hammond's development team." "Did you confirm it matched county records?" Her voice wavered. "I cross-referenced the data with updated municipal records, but those older files might not fully reflect current topography." Clint retrieved a map from the clerk's desk. "This one's from last year. It aligns exactly with my claim. Can you show me anywhere on your digital model that accounts for such a discrepancy?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'd have to check more thoroughly, but as I've stated, the shift could be due to new measurements." Clint held her gaze. "Yet you didn't physically check the boundary markers on site?" Silence fell. She swallowed. "No, I did not." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, and for the first time, Judge Bascom's expression faltered. Clint's calm approach was more effective than anyone expected. He turned toward the bench. "No further questions." The judge glanced at Denton, who looked flustered. He stood and tried to salvage the testimony, but the damage was done. Warren stepped down, avoiding everyone's eyes. Morning melted into afternoon. Witness after witness stepped up, some supporting Clint's claim, others backing Hammond. Still, a pattern emerged. Hammond's team either skirted direct answers or cited vague measurement errors. Clint, on the other hand, presented clear, methodical evidence. Each time Denton tried to discredit him, Clint responded with a quiet rebuttal, referencing facts from official archives that left Denton scowling. Throughout, Judge Bascom's skepticism never fully lifted. She peered down at Clint as though waiting for him to slip up. But slip up he did not. By the end of the day, she adjourned court with a curt promise to resume the following morning. The crowd dispersed, and the press circled both parties like sharks. "Mr. Eastwood, how do you remain so calm?" one reporter asked as Clint stepped outside. He offered a mild shrug. "I've seen bigger battles than a property dispute. I trust the law will do its job if given the chance." Behind him, Hammond muttered to Denton, "He's grandstanding. Let's see him hold out tomorrow. I've got my own ace in the hole." The next morning, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Clint arrived early, took his seat, and reviewed his notes. This time, Hammond strutted in with a grin that spread from ear to ear. Denton patted him on the shoulder, looking far too pleased. Once the session began, Denton rose and requested a special witness. Judge Ronald Endicott, a retired appellate judge turned consultant. Supposedly, Endicott was there to clarify property law complexities. But the moment he took the stand, it became clear he intended to sow doubt about Clint's approach. Mr. Eastwood's perspective, Endicott drawled, is that old surveys are infallible. However, modern jurisprudence recognizes that boundary lines can evolve. Courts often favor current development needs, especially if the disputed land was underutilized. He glanced at Clint. No offense, sir, but you might be holding on to an outdated notion of property rights. Clint listened without expression. Denton shot him a triumphant look, certain this cameo from a seasoned legal figure would tip the scales. Then Clint cross-examined. Judge Endicott, he began, you said courts may favor current developments if the land is underutilized. Are you aware of cases where land was forcibly taken without proper compensation, and the court upheld the original owner's rights? Endicott blinked. Of course, but each situation, Clint cut in, not rudely but firmly. So there's no blanket policy that always sides with development? No, Endicott admitted. It depends on specific circumstances. Clint held up an official letter from the city planning department, dated well before Hammond's development began. Are you also aware that I sought to protect this land as a conservation area? That I filed a request to keep it untouched? Endicott turned to Denton, who stared at the document in disbelief. I wasn't informed of that, Endicott said. Clint stepped closer, offering the letter to be read into evidence. Then would you agree that building on land intended for conservation is a direct violation of the owner's stated purpose? Endicott's jaw tightened. If that's the case, it could significantly impact the court's view. Denton's triumph dissolved. Judge Bascom seemed rattled, but to her credit, she kept a steady face. She turned to Denton. Counsel, were you aware of this letter? Denton cleared his throat. We didn't deem it relevant, Your Honor. After all, it was just a request, not an approved measure. Clint responded calmly. Not approved yet, but it shows I had clear plans for the land, plans that your client disregarded. The judge called for a brief recess. As people filed out, reporters swarmed again, each new revelation adding to the swirl of headlines. Suddenly, Hammond's strong position looked shaky. Clint slipped away to a corner of the hallway, not entertaining cameras, but quietly discussing the matter with a local friend who'd shown up for moral support. Inside the courtroom, Denton tried to coach Hammond, who was fuming. You said you did your homework, Hammond snapped. Now we've got surprise letters and half the witnesses are on his side. Denton scowled. He's thorough. I underestimated that. We need a bigger move or we'll lose. When court resumed, Judge Bascom eyed both parties. Mr. Denton, do you have additional testimony before we move on? Denton steeled himself and called for a final argument, hoping to sway the court by painting Clint as a man clinging to sentimental notions. Your Honor, the land in question was vacant. My client's development brings economic growth, jobs, housing. Surely the county benefits more from that than some idle stretch of scrubland. Clint leaned over his table, his jaw tightening. He waited until Denton finished, then rose. So it's fine if someone decides another person's property is worth taking, if it leads to profit. Denton maintained his fake smile. This is about progress, sir. Clint placed his palms on the podium, addressing the judge but letting his voice fill the room. Progress means nothing without respect for the law. If we ignore boundaries just because one side has more money, where does it end? The judge inhaled, her gaze sliding from Clint to Denton, then to Hammond, who slumped in frustration. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then she cleared her throat. I believe we've heard enough. We'll break for lunch, then return for closing statements. Outside, the midday sun cast harsh shadows on the courthouse steps. A throng of journalists bombarded Clint with cameras and questions. Are you confident you'll win? What happens if the court rules against you? He didn't puff out his chest or swagger. He simply said, it's in the judge's hands. I've done what I can. Hammond barreled past the crowd, ignoring questions, yanking at his collar. He faced potential losses in the millions if forced to remove or redesign his partially built structures. An hour later, everyone reconvened. The gallery was silent with anticipation. Judge Bascom instructed them, we will now hear closing arguments. Mr. Denton, you first. Denton launched into a well-rehearsed speech. He highlighted property laws that favored development, underscored how new surveys could override older ones, and emphasized that Hammond acted in good faith, having been unaware of the boundary complication until it was too late. In Denton's retelling, Clint was a nostalgic landowner refusing to adapt to modern needs. Then it was Clint's turn. The entire room seemed to lean forward. Even the judge stared intently, as though she couldn't quite reconcile her early dismissal of him with the skill he'd shown. He began quietly, not with theatrics, but with a simple recounting of facts. I didn't want a lawsuit. I tried reason, phone calls, letters. Hammond's team dismissed everyone. Meanwhile, I compiled documents from the county, had the land surveyed again, and discovered they were encroaching further and further. This wasn't a little slip. It was 3 acres of blatant intrusion. He paused, turning slowly toward the jury box. Maybe it's easy to think I'm just some old-timer stuck in the past, but that land matters to me. Not for profit, but for conservation and personal reasons. The law's job is to protect each person's rights, whether they're a big developer or a single landowner. A hush fell. Denton tried to hide his annoyance as Clint continued. If we allow business interests to override clear boundaries, we send a message that might makes right. We can't let that stand. He finished simply, "That's all I've got to say." He returned to his seat, ignoring the anxious buzz that erupted in the gallery. Judge Bascom folded her hands. "This court will adjourn so I can review the evidence. We will reconvene for the verdict tomorrow morning." Her gavel struck. Outside, it felt like the aftermath of a climactic scene. News vans lined the street, headlights and cameras glaring in the evening light. Observers debated which side would prevail. Many admitted they'd come expecting to watch a legendary actor flounder in the legal arena, only to witness a poised, fact-based presentation. That night, speculation ran wild across news networks. Some pundits opined that sentimental favoritism might sway the court toward Clint. Others insisted developers rarely lose. Online threads lit up with commentary about property rights, generational respect, and whether Clint Eastwood's stoic persona would hold sway over a skeptical judge. Morning brought a tense final assembly. Judge Bascom emerged, stone-faced, and instructed everyone to stand. Once seated, she explained she'd carefully weighed both arguments. Then she read from her prepared statement, eyes flickering toward Clint, then Hammond. In the matter of Clint Eastwood versus Derek Hammond and Hammond Real Estate Holdings, this court finds for Mr. Eastwood. The evidence shows unlawful overreach onto his property, despite repeated warnings. We order that construction be halted immediately. Furthermore, the defendant must restore the disputed land to its prior state and pay damages to Mr. Eastwood. A gasp swept the room. Judge Bascom paused, then looked at Clint. "It appears you did your homework, Mr. Eastwood. Let the record show that thorough evidence and proper adherence to procedures can prevail, even without formal legal counsel." Hammond stared in disbelief. Denton's mouth fell open, and furious whispers flew between them. Clint, composed as ever, merely inclined his head in acknowledgement. It wasn't triumphant gloating, just the calm of a man who believed in doing things right. The press tried to corner Hammond on his way out, but he brushed them aside, calling the verdict unfair and promising an appeal. Denton, pale and tight-lipped, could only mutter that future steps would be evaluated. By contrast, reporters surrounded Clint, firing off congratulations and questions. "Did you ever doubt yourself?" one asked. Clint considered. "Doubt is natural," he answered, "but if your case is truthful, you stand by it." That night, the local news led with the story of Clint's victory. Opinion pieces hailed him as a champion for the everyday landowner. Legal analysts marveled at how quietly he dismantled the opposition. Social media buzzed with references to his old film lines, but there was a new respect behind them, less novelty, more admiration for his steady fortitude.